Hello and welcome to the Altered Project. Today guys, we will venture across the Polar Northern Wall and step foot into the snowy region. I really need to make a new name for that. But yeah, I think it is my first video ever made in this part of Alter and I'm super hyped to see what we can do. Today's plan is to fill this cavern up with a bunch of ice and some very dead skeletons. However, not just any skeletons, as they are absolutely massive. These skeletons belong to the past giants who immigrated from the dark realm of Lucifer and moved to this world only to face a very cold end during their war with the humans. So without further ado, let's get started. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I thought the cavern was a little too dark to make anything in it, so I thought of using the sea lantern tactic I used in my Bahua cave video, but instead decided to poke holes on the ceiling. I then went on using the brush tool to make the whole cavern look visually more icy. At first I thought of solely using ice blocks to cover the walls of the cavern, however shortly after I discovered that these blocks aren't very transparent, so I shifted to using a mix of cyan stained glass and light blue stained glass as the base and sprinkled some ice blocks for specific areas instead. Then I moved on to what is arguably the most important build of this video, the giant skeletons. The first few skeletons I made were built without a reference, which is something I would later regret on, you'll see. But nevertheless, I built a diagonally facing skull numero uno, and then I smashed it into a wall. And here is a good example of why you should look at references on subjects you don't know much about. I mean, those were supposed to be ribs, and for some reason they're growing out of its neck. Yeah, I quickly noticed that something was wrong here and lowered the placement of the ribs. However, if you know your anatomy, you know that ribs don't really look like the way I made them, and well, yeah, we'll get to that later. After building skull ribs number 1, I went ahead and built several other skulls, not specifically limited to humans though. I made skulls of mammoths as well. Quite a small mammoth, but a mammoth. I then moved those skulls to where I thought looked good and started playing with the landscape a little. I didn't really have to make huge changes to the cavern since I liked how it looked in its natural form, so instead I focused on the texturing of the landscape. At first I was hesitant about adding any man-made structures, but decided to build this broken bridge here, as it looked pretty cool and standing here you could get a better view of that darling over there. So what to do with the space below? I considered spreading the texture of the caves down here as well, but I liked how it looked in the beginning when there was still water. However, I didn't want too much water since I was planning on making something else on the snowy walls over there, so to solve this problem I decided to make the body of water frozen. However, frozen only on the outside. Inside is an aquatic area where you can explore even further on the bottom of the, I don't know what to call this, basin? Lake? Frozen thing? Are these aquatic plants frozen in time? I made a few of these all around the area and yeah, I think they look pretty cool. So more skeletons, this time though with a reference. While making skull rib number 1, I noticed that I didn't know much about the human anatomy as I thought I did. So I gave myself a little refresher of how the skeleton of the human body looked like, particularly the skull and chest area. So let's go ahead and learn a little of the human anatomy as it can help you with building, drawing skeletons, and much more. So let's get started with the skull. I used the brush tool to make a smooth quartz base and rather than adding on decided to carve in instead to shape the skull. I began with shaping what professionals call the nasal bone, which you might think is the bone located right beneath the ridge of your nose, but it's really located a little more above that, right between your eyes actually. The hard stuff you feel when you touch the ridge of your nose is actually called the upper lateral cartilage and is more of a tissue rather than a bone, so we're going to ignore making that for now. Then I added on the orbit, which is the fancy word of saying eye socket. One tip when building the orbit is to make the inside visible even from the side view of the skull. To my surprise, orbits aren't just two holes that are carved cleanly out from the frontal face of the skull, but a part of it actually stretches out to the sides as well. And then there are a bunch of other parts within the orbit that we can talk about, but we're going to skip those for time's sake. We now move on to the maxilla, which is this part around the nose. And the tip to building this part in Minecraft was to push in the bone area close to the cheek and pull out the area above and directly under the nose. And of course, below we have the teeth, in which I use bone blocks to make. Next is what I think is one of the most important areas of the skull that helps define the shape of the face, and that is the zygomatic bone, which is the bone structure right beneath your cheek and is also one of the most convex bone parts of the skull. The tip for building this bone part is to stick the bone out, especially to the side a little. Then I focused on this depression of the skull directly behind the zygomatic bone. This part is made up of the sphenoid and temporal bone, and the tip for making this area is to just be aware that there is a sudden depression in the skull besides the zygomatic bone, so yeah, don't forget about that. And then we have the jaws, or mandible. The focus point here is to build the jaw as a U shape from below, and to not let any part of it stretch farther out than the zygomatic bone. Also, don't forget about making the chin pointed. Now, some people may ask, hey Alter Project, what the hell is that scar thing you left on the skull? That, my friends, is the closest I got to depicting the squamous... Whoa, let me search. That, my friends, is the closest I got to depicting the squamous suture. Suture refers to a stitch or a row of stitches holding together the edges of a wound. Basically, in the case of this skull, it is where different parts of the skull meet, and I wanted to somehow implement at least one of the sutures in this skull. I don't know, I kind of like it. The rest of the skull, or head, was like shaping an egg, although my skull looks rather like a drooping octopus. And that is pretty much all of the focus points for making a skull. I probably should have said this in the beginning, but if you use World Edit, it is easier to build one half of the skull first and then simply copy and flip that to the other side later. Now let's finally move on to the ribs. So I started with locating where the top of the sternum is, which is that bone located in the center of your chest. Looking at this image, I decided to place the starting point of the sternum half a face below where the jaw is. From there, I built the rest of the sternum and continued building the two lower cartilages that branches off the sternum bone. And yes, it surprised me as well, but those parts are not bones, but are actually cartilages. Pretty cool. Am I the only person who didn't know that? Now that we have this upside down Y, I started counting 10 ribs, including the top and bottom, and then stretched them out. The focus point here was to make the silhouette of the ribs look perfectly curved. The vast majority of humans are born with 12 pairs of ribs, 2 of them of which are called floating ribs and are located at the very end of the thoracic vertebrae. However, we would not be including these 2 in the build because I was completely ignorant of the fact that these 2 pairs existed at all when I was building the skeleton. Another tip for making the ribs are, instead of building the ribs completely flat, build them so that they go upwards as the ribs recede back. And the final part of the skeleton we'll be focusing on is the spinal column. Now the spinal column is made up of 5 different sections of vertebrae, and today we will be only making the top 3, which are the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. The spinal column is kind of like a dangling ramen noodle as it is very curvy. So the focus point here when building the spinal column is to make the outline curved and to also focus on depicting these lines that define each of the vertebrae in Minecraft. And that's pretty much it, guys. Hopefully I did a decent job on explaining the anatomical parts I focused on when building this half skeleton. I mean, the next time your science teacher asks what are the 5 parts of the spinal column, you can now at least answer the top 3. Sacrum and coccyx are the name of the bottom 2, by the way, if that really happens. So without further ado, let's move these giants into the cold ice and we should have ourselves a pretty damn cool ice cavern. So that is about all I have for the building process. Let's move on to the cinematic, shall we? So that is pretty much all I have for today's video, folks. I definitely will be coming back to this cavern to add more content and details soon, but until then we'll be keeping yourselves busy by working on some other projects, such as the Alter Project quiz, in which my friend will be testing me on how much I remember the stuff I said in my past videos. It was really fun reviewing the things I've said in the past, and I think it is a really good compilation of fun facts that might be interesting to you guys as well. So that is pretty much it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.